Greetings, fellow mathematicians. Let's talk about the mathematics that children will investigate in Year 4. Children will extend their understanding of addition and subtraction to include adding and subtracting 5-digit numbers, including as money. They will also investigate adding and subtracting combinations of odd and even numbers, and they will use their understanding to then check calculations. In place value, they will count by hundreds, thousands, tens and ones, on and off the decade, the hundred and the thousands, and they will investigate which digits change and which digits don't and why. In place value, they will also extend their understanding of multiplicative place value. Now in Year 3, they began to investigate place value multiplicatively. This means that they were beginning to understand that we get the values of the digits by multiplying by 10 as we go up a column and dividing by 10 as we come down a column. This is now extended to include decimals. So when we have our lowest column as the ones column, as the world did for about 1,000 years after the Hindus invented our place value system, around about 1500, the Europeans and the Arabic mathematicians decided to extend place value to include fractions. They did this by dividing the 1 by 10, which gave them a tenth. Now this understanding is vital so that children have a deep understanding of why the column to the right of the ones column is tenths. They then divided the tenths by 10 and got hundredths. This is the learning that children will begin to investigate in Term 1 of Year 4. Children will then use standard and non-standard place value to describe numbers up to 5 digits that include decimals. So for example, standard place value might be 4.3, might be 4 ones and 3 tenths. Standard place value just means we're going to name the values of the digits. Non-standard place value, 4.3 could be, say, 3 ones and 13 tenths, 2 ones and 23 tenths, 1 one and 33 tenths, or 43 tenths. So children will also be investigating creating designs by reflecting, translating and rotating, and they will identify symmetry and tessellation, and they will create patterns. Now a great way to include this in lots of investigating lessons is to include it as art lessons as well. That's what I used to do when I was in the classroom and had my own class. They're also going to measure and convert metric length units using, first of all, converting to fractions. So say for example we had 1 metre and 23 centimetres. So we're going to have 1 metre, and because we know 1 centimetre is 100th of a metre, 23 centimetres will be 23 hundredths of a metre. We can then convert that to a decimal, 1.23, using the learning and the understanding that we're getting from investigating tenths and hundredths. We can then express 1 metre and 23 centimetres as 1.23 metres. Children will also be investigating time using AM and PM time, which is simply done by subtracting 12 from the PM time. In Term 2 of Year 4, children will continue their investigation of adding and subtracting 5-digit numbers, including as money. They will also continue their investigation of multiplication and division, multiplying using the distributive property as they investigate multiplication by 9 and by 6. They will be dividing, relating division to fractions by when they divide by 9, they'll be finding a ninth. When they divide by 6, they'll be finding a sixth. They will also be investigating equivalent fractions. They will make a fraction wall, and once they've made their fraction wall with their halves, quarters, eighths, thirds, sixths, twelfths, fifths and tenths, they will then select a fraction, for example a half, and they will make a fraction wall under their half. So they will see that a half is 2/4, 4/8, and so on. They will then record all the fractions that are equivalent to a half, and they will look for a relationship between the numerator and the denominator. So for example, in fractions that are equivalent to a half, the numerator is half of the denominator. So 1 is half of 2, 5 is half of 10, 3 is half of 6. So then they will be able to create other fractions that are equivalent to a half using the relationship between the numerator and the denominator. They will then go on to investigating non-unit fractions. So say for example 2/3, 2/3, 4/6. Again, looking for the relationship between the numerator and the denominator. If the fraction has the same relationship between the numerator and the denominator, then the fractions are equivalent. So 2 is 2/3 of 3. 4 is 2/3 of 6. They will also be investigating testing angles. Now they're not going to be using a protractor. Protractors don't come in until year 5, and that's because people were testing angles long before they invented an instrument like a protractor. So they're going to make angle testers. They can make an angle tester by putting a chenille stick inside of a straw, or they could make an angle tester using folded paper. All of this is in the learning plans and the investigations. They then are going to test 2-line angles and 1-line angles. Now using the paper angle testers, they can test angles to see if they are right angles, halves of right angles, 1.5 right angles, 1/3 of a right angle, 2/3 of a right angle, 1 1/3 right angles, 1 2/3 right angles, and straight angles. Children will also be investigating 2-dimensional shapes and the 2-dimensional shapes that result from combining and splitting other 2-dimensional shapes. Again, this is a great activity to do during an art lesson. Children will also find the area of non-rectangular shapes using square centimetres and square metres. And they will also use the key, the compass, grid references, angles and scale to investigate maps using alphanumeric grids. In Term 3 of Year 4, children will investigate patterns. They will investigate patterns adding and subtracting fractions. Now the best way to investigate this is to use a number line. So they may, for example, count in multiples of halves or multiples of quarters. They will also be investigating patterns using skip counting of whole numbers. They will start to call the numbers in the pattern terms. So they will identify terms. They will identify how the pattern repeats. From this, they will create a rule, and they will create the rule using multiplication and division. Because their pattern will contain multiples of numbers, they'll be able to create rules that use multiplication and division. They will also continue their investigation of multiplication and division, multiplication using the distributive property as they multiply by 8 and by 7. And they will be dividing by 8 and by 7 as they use the relationship between fractions and division. They will also be continuing their investigation and their development of understanding of addition by continuing to add and subtract up to 5-digit numbers throughout the term as well. Now they'll also be investigating equivalent fractions on a number line. So placing, for example, halves on a number line. And a great way to do this is to have a number line, say, between 0 and 1, and then walk your fingers along until you get halfway, and continue walking until you get 2 halves of the way. Then walk your fingers along 1/4, 2 quarters, and this is where the children will see that 2 quarters and 1/2 are in the same place on a number line. Children will also be sketching the vertices, the edges and the faces of prisms, pyramids, cylinders and cones, And they will also be making cubic models and then sketching them from different perspectives, sketching the top view, the front view, the back view, the left view, the right view, and the bottom view. And they will also be using liquid measurement to measure volume and capacity. So they'll be using a measuring jug with a scale that's in millilitres, and they will convert between litres and millilitres, again using fractions and then using the place value of decimals to hundredths that they began to investigate earlier in the year. And they will also be measuring the amount of water displaced when we place an object into it. And the amount of water displaced is equal to the volume of the object. In term 4 of year 4, children will continue to add and subtract up to 5-digit numbers, and they will also continue to multiply by single-digit numbers and divide by single-digit numbers. They will also investigate number sentences to find unknown qualities for addition and subtraction, and they may begin to investigate adding and subtracting using an algorithm. But a word about algorithms. Algorithms were invented so that people had a quick way to calculate. We no longer need a quick way to calculate because we have calculators on our phones at our disposal 24 hours of the day. So children are never actually going to use an algorithm when they are an adult. So rather than focusing on algorithms, the focus is on using place value and properties and relationships to add and subtract. Children will also be solving problems involving multiplication and division, and they will be creating surveys to ask questions to gather data using one-to-many correspondence. So this is where we have too much data to fit into a column. So we're going to have to use, say, each square is going to equal 2 people or 3 people or something like that. They're going to then ask and answer questions about the data using the language of chance. They're going to order chance by most likely, least likely. And then they're also going to investigate when the chance of one event happening affects the chance of another thing happening. So for example, if I have one die and I roll a 6, that means that I cannot roll any other number on that same roll. But if I have 2 dice and I roll a 6 on this die, that does not affect the chance of me rolling any other number on the other die. Children are also going to convert between time units, convert between days, hours, minutes and seconds. And they're going to investigate calendars and timetables and timelines. And they're going to use scale when they're investigating the timelines. They're going to investigate money as numbers to 2 decimal places, linking it to their investigation of decimals to hundredths, and developing their understanding that cents are hundredths of a dollar. They're also going to investigate other countries' currencies. This could be a little research project if you like. They're going to investigate temperature on a scale thermometer. And they're also going to investigate mass in grams and kilograms using a set of scales, which of course includes a scale. They're going to convert between grams and kilograms using fractions of a kilogram. So this is the mathematics that children will learn in Year 4.